Hey guys, Ace here and welcome to PHP tutorial number 9. Once again we find ourselves covering the usual. That is, in this tutorial we're going to be looking at the if statement, and the else statement, and the else if statement. So, to sum up, we're going to be looking at if blocks, okay, which is what they're called. Let's go ahead and open up our notepad file. We just got the basic page and the style page, of course, which just gives me the cool layout I use. So just a basic HTML setup. I'm just using a header and a div. Sorry, here's a div, the content div, just to style it, that's all. And then we're just getting straight into the PHP. Now, what we actually find is that in an if block, in an if statement even, we need to have some value that evaluates to either true or false. Okay, so here I've just written up a few variables which will evaluate to false. Okay, if we have a variable, for instance this variable called var1, and it has a null value, so if any variable has a null value and we try and use it inside an if block, we will get a false. The value inside the value that the if will get from that variable will be a false, because null is in PHP's mind is false. Okay. Now, if we have a variable which contains the value 0, we will also get false, because anything that's 0 is false in PHP. Anything other than 0 is true though, and we'll get onto that in just a sec. Anything that has the actual value false will evaluate to false. I'm pretty sure that's fairly obvious. I can't remember if we covered these, but basically these are what are called Boolean variables. And Boolean variables contain either a true or false value. So in this case, the Boolean variable var3 contains the false value. Okay, and that's why it evaluates to false. And finally, any variable that well, I guess this is actually the same as this one. Any variable that hasn't been assigned to is basically null, so it evaluates to false. This one may look different from this one, okay? But actually, if you think about it, they're the same. Because here, this variable, you haven't defined it, so it contains a null value, or in other words, no value. Here we're defining it, but we're defining it with a null value, in other words, no value. So basically, they're actually the same. And so all these four, they will evaluate to false, okay? As you can see, I've commented all false. Now let's look at some values that can be true. One that may surprise you is that a minus number, any variable that contains a minus number, is in fact true, because the only thing that can be false in terms of numbers is 0, so anything other than 0 is actually true, even if it's a minus number. Some 1 will evaluate to true. Okay, so minus numbers, true. Positive numbers, true as well, so some 2 will evaluate to true. The Boolean value true inside a variable will evaluate to true. Okay. And of course here I'm just demonstrating the opposite of what this is. I'm demonstrating a variable assigned to something. In this case, rather than do it with numbers like I've done here, I've shown that anything that contains a string that is something will evaluate to true. Notice, doing this, actually I'll just put a new one up here. Oops, no caps. This will also evaluate to true, because while it looks like it's a string containing absolutely nothing, not even a space. If there's a space there, this will actually evaluate to true. If it's just two quotes right next to each other, probably should be single quotes, if it's two quotes right next to each other and they have absolutely nothing in between them, that will evaluate to false. So the key thing here is that there is an actual string. It's not just an empty string, which will evaluate to false, as I've said about 5 times now. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so let's look at how we actually use an if statement. We already know what if statements take. So basically, all we have to do is learn how to use them. Now, an if statement basically looks like this. Oops, one less space. condition, there we go. That should be, one sec guys. Okay. So basically, we have the if block, it takes a condition, and then it has something to do if the condition is true. So first we have to write out the keyword if, then we write the two parentheses, and then we write the condition between parentheses, and then we write what you want to do if the condition is true. Okay? So only if the condition is true in this if statement will this expression or statement be executed, okay? And that's the layout of an if statement. So basically what we're doing here is we're writing the if, as we said, writing the two parentheses, we're writing our condition here, which is, this may not look like a condition, okay? But it actually is, because as we discussed before, variables will evaluate to a true or false value when used inside an if block like this. So while this may look a bit weird, we're saying if var1, what we're actually saying is if the value inside var1 evaluates to true, then echo out var1 has a value that evaluates to true, line break. Okay? So when we use var1 here, what you got to remember is that variables are not necessarily an alias, but they're sort of, they are sort of an alias though, but they store their own values. So in this case they're an alias. When we use them inside an if block, what the if block actually sees, it doesn't see the variable name var1, it sees the value inside var1. So in this case, var1 is actually an alias for whatever value is inside var1, which is of course a null value. So as we've discussed, var1 will evaluate to false, okay, and therefore this statement will not be executed because the condition is not true. If the condition isn't true, so it comes to the if block. It says if var1 evaluates to true, echo this. Hey, wait a minute, var1 doesn't evaluate to true. Skip this stuff and go to the ending curly brace. Okay, and then it will just continue on to the PHP code. So the next statement we've actually got is if sum1. Now let's look at the variable sum1. It has a value -1, and as we discussed, -1 will evaluate to a true value, because anything that's not 0 in terms of numbers will evaluate to true. So sum1 has a value that evaluates to true, line break. This should theoretically output, and let's take a look at if it actually does. Let's just refresh, and here we can see sum1 has a value that evaluates to true. It outputs as expected. Okay. Now we're going to move on to something a bit more complicated than this. Here we're just using an if, but in more complicated blocks we might have an if and we might have an else. So let's take a look at this. Here we're saying if var1, so this is exactly the same as up here. If var1 evaluates to true, echo var1 has a value that evaluates to true. Okay, but then we've got an else. So the only way this else will output is if the value inside this if evaluates to false. So in this case, var1 evaluates to false. So this won't be output. It gets to the end of the closing curly brace, and it hits this else, and it's like, wait a minute, we just had a false value from the above if. That must mean that we have to output. We have to do whatever statements are inside the else block. Okay, so for this reason, the statements inside else will be output. Okay, let's take a look at this running again. var1 has a value that evaluates to false, which is what was inside here. var1 has it, and there you go. Okay, line break, of course. And again, we're just doing the same thing with the sum1 variable, but in this case, the else won't be output because the if statement says, hey, wait a minute, sum1 evaluates to true, so